It is time. Excellent. And I've lost my mouse, so that's a good start. Excellent. We're going. Who doesn't want a bit of a virtual conference? Now, I have one last thing to kick off before we get going. I'm just going to do some magic in the background. Enjoy a picture of myself or my family done as Simpsons characters. Jakob did ask if I was going to have a Simpsons reference inside of this talk, and well, there is a starting Simpsons reference, which is not showing. Awesome, because it was on the wrong screen. Good start. Well, everyone, welcome to the learning how to unleash the power of Visual Studio Code. My name is Aaron Powell, and I'm a cloud advocate here at Microsoft. I've been doing web development for a little over 15 years now, so I've got a lot of experience with a whole variety of different editor tools, whether it's your simple things like Notepad and Nano. Like, I actually did a lot of my early work, particularly throughout uni, using Linux machines. So I was using things like Nano as my primary editor. Shout out to anyone that remembers Nano and the level of power that you got from an editor like that. All the way up to your more complex like editing suites like Visual Studio or Eclipse, Xcode, or is Xcode classed as like advanced, or it's complex? I'm not sure. And Dreamweaver, can we call Dreamweaver an advanced editor? I think we can. But anyway, you're not here to just hear about me and my history. You're here to learn about Visual Studio Code and how to make the most out of it. Now, I know a number of you that are on the call, and so you're actually on a different monitor. So when I turn my head, I'm looking at you and seeing all your smiling faces and hoping that I haven't had anyone fall asleep yet. But I know a lot of you are probably already using Visual Studio Code. So for this talk, my hope is that you're going to take away a couple of tips, one or two things that are going to change the way that you use Visual Studio Code, make your life a little bit easier, and really change the way that you structure your development environments, stuff like that. If you're new to Visual Studio Code, I hope you take away more than a couple of tips, because I've got a lot of stuff that I want to cover off, and there's a lot of things that Visual Studio Code can do. But let's first start talking a bit about what VS Code is, what it can be used for, and just make sure that we're all on the same page. Like I said, some people might be new to VS Code, and I want to make sure that we don't lose you kind of 2 minutes into the talk. We'll have you, continuing to join us throughout the whole thing. So VS Code, like if we think in that spectrum of editors, where we've got like Notepad at one end and like full Visual Studio at the other end, it sort of sits in the middle. Like, VS Code is actually a pretty simplistic editor. It doesn't do a lot of stuff out of the box. It understands some basic language syntax highlighting for like JavaScript and HTML and C#, things like that. But it doesn't understand how to debug any of those languages. It doesn't know how to format any text. Really, so it's really designed to be an editor that you add extensions to make it the thing that is going to be right for you, and like all the stuff that you need to be productive in the kind of applications you're building. Now, VS Code is actually written in WebTech. It's written in HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. And as a result of that, it's compiled to Electron, and that's how we do cross-platform. So VS Code can work on Windows, Mac, or Linux, and it's actually the same editor experience regardless of where you're at. And the power of that is that the extension model also is portable across all operating systems. So anything that you want to do on the different, like from an extensibility standpoint, or the way you want to customize your editor, if you start on a Windows machine but then move on to a Mac, you can actually take that same editor experience. If you're working in a team, that team can have the same experience regardless of what their choice of desktop operating system or their operating system of choice is. So, what does VS Code look like if my slides want to advance? There we go. Animations. So this is VS Code. For those of you who haven't used it or seen it before, let's just kind of break it down for the terminology we got. We've got a title bar across the top. Pretty much every application has a title bar of some form. It's got our icon, file, edit, view, etc. But with VS Code, we also have this sort of addressable section across the top where there is things like the file name, index.html, the folder I've got open, foldable, and then some other information. Now, the reason I want to call your attention to that is that's something you can customize. If that's not the information you need in there, like I don't need to see every single time that it's VS Code Insiders, which is I'm using the preview version of VS Code, but all the stuff I'm going to talk about today is applicable to this stable version. So yeah, like maybe you just want to drop that. You should go to settings. You can edit that. Maybe you want to see a full path, not just a file name in that section. You can go ahead and do that quite easily through settings. Next up, we have the sidebar. Default's down here on the left, but we can put it on the right again through settings if that's where we prefer to have things. And this gives us access to like our folder structure, search, debugging, extensions, those sorts of things. But it also is where extensions can contribute additional functionality. Down at the bottom, I've got some icons for Docker and for Azure, and that's because I've got a couple of extensions installed around those. Now, I'm going to talk a bit more about extensions later on in the talk, but I'll refer to things that are provided by extensions like, as we hit them going through. Next, we have across the bottom our status bar. The status bar is, again, like quick information about the environment and the files that we've got open. I can see what branch I'm on. I'm on the main branch. I have some uncommitted changes indicated by the asterisk against it. I don't actually have any errors in this application because I write bug-free code every single time, that kind of stuff. But maybe I don't need that information all the time. Like, do I really need to see that this is a UTF-8 file and it's an LF and it's HTML? I can tell that it's HTML because I've got it open and I'm looking at it. Well, I can actually remove that by just modifying the way the status bar is and the stuff that I have in there. So I can just remove the options that are not relevant for me, customize the editor to what I want it to be. Next up, we have a terminal zone. So this is where I can create use the inbuilt terminal. This will default to the shell of the operating system you're running on, like your default shell. This is connected to a Linux environment, so this is running ZSH with a Tmux multiplexer over the top because I like to make things as complicated as I can when I'm working with a terminal. But this would be PowerShell or cmd.exe if that's your preferred one. If anyone's using cmd.exe, come see me in the Slack channel afterwards because I really want to know why, and you're probably doing it. But you can customize that to whatever you want it to be, as complex or as simple as you need. But it's also where we have things like our debug console, our output from tasks that are run, errors or warnings that happen in the application. Well, we get all that information in here. And now we actually have the editor surface. I realize I've been talking for like 4 minutes about the editor itself. We haven't even said, you can type text in it and it's going to syntax file it and hopefully it results in compiling or running code. Yeah, there's a text editor surface. Who would have thought an editor had that? And it does exactly what you would expect it to do. You type in it, it has things appear when you do key presses, and it's got syntax highlighting, and this is a HTML file, and it's highlighted appropriately for that. Lastly, on the right-hand side, we have our minimap. The minimap is kind of a 10,000-foot view of the file that you've got open. So if you've got a file that's quite long, obviously that's going to expand further down the editor. You can use that to quickly navigate up and down if you prefer. You can see some of the syntax highlighting is actually bleeding through, so you can see where things are. Like this is a HTML file that actually has a lot of comments in it, so you can see that there's a lot of HTML right at the very top, and then most of the comments below that. If I had errors or warnings, those would also be appearing as the appropriate color highlighting inside of the minimap, so I can jump up and down that file quite easily to them. But now I want to talk about being productive with VS Code, because that's the first thing that I think is good to understand, like some good productivity tips as we take the journey over the next kind of 43 odd minutes. And being productive is, I guess, a kind of subjective term, though. Like, being productive is a little different to everyone else's. Like, I'm very much a keyboard person. I spent a lot of time using Linux and just working through TDY, so I didn't have a mouse. Like, I didn't use a mouse. And also trying to get a mouse driver to work on a 486 laptop was never going to happen in Linux. So I just generally didn't have a mouse. So I spent a lot of my time trying to optimize the way that I work with keyboard shortcuts. And VS Code lends itself very nicely to that. It is something that can be highly keyboard driven. And for me, that's really appealing as an editor. But that's enough slides for now. Let's jump over to a VS Code instance and actually start having a look at some of this stuff that I'm talking about. Now, the first shortcut key is Control-Shift-P. I'm going to use the Windows shortcut keys because I'm on a Windows machine and I have a Windows keyboard. If you're on a Mac, by and large, you can translate where I use Control to Command. But also, I'll provide you the links to the keyboard shortcut reference document. So like if you're on a Mac, you can see like the specific ones that are there. The first thing I'm going to turn on is screencast mode. Screencast mode allows me to show you precisely what I'm typing. It's going to pop up in a banner just through the middle, and so as I do keyboard shortcuts, you can see them. You don't have to be like, I can't see your keyboard as you're pressing stuff. I didn't do like what those Twitch streamers do, where you got like the top-down camera over the keyboard, and you can watch me doing magic as I go around. I have my VS Code instance here, and we'll see our keyboard shortcuts. I'm going to pop open the File Explorer, which is with Control-P, which is just like a shorthand way of getting to files. And I'm going to grab a file that I've got here, which is basically my speaker notes. So if you want to just kind of tune out, you can read the speaker notes now and then just nod off for the next 5 minutes or so while we have a look at some of the shortcuts. But Control Comma is one that I use a lot. This jumps into the settings, and from here I can say, well, is the font size big enough? So I can do font size, search for that. Let's bump it up to say 26. It's probably a bit big, so we can come back. But Control Comma, being able to quickly jump into the settings, that's one of the, I've just committed to muscle memory, because a lot of what you can do in VS Code, you just drive through the settings, optimize it and modify it for what you need. Code actions, this is something that you can, you might see light bulbs appearing. So if I jump into a different file here, I have a yellow squiggly here on line 70, the heading example. And if I do Control dot, that activates that little light bulb, the code action that's there. If you come from Visual Studio, you're probably fairly familiar with code actions. I use them in C# to like import a using statement or extract an interface of a type or something like that. Here, this is a Markdown file. I have a Markdown lint plugin, and it's just telling me that I shouldn't have duplicated headings because I have the heading example multiple times within inside of this file. But Control dot will just get you to that. And again, if I've got the right language packs installed, for that, if it's a C# application, I can import the using statement. If it's a Node application, bring the require or the import statement for the external dependencies. Duplicating lines. So Alt Shift up and down, duplicate above or duplicate below. Just one of those ones that until you start remembering that you can do it, it's one that you don't even realize that you need. I use it a lot for just like creating variables, and you duplicate a couple of variables and then rename them in line rather than having to type out like const something equals. Let's just save the number of key presses that we've got to do. Control Shift Alt and then up or down will expand our cursor over the lines in the direction of the arrow, so up or down. And then that allows us to do like multi-line selection. So I've just then done Control and then done box selection over the words inside of that. Or I could just do like a single character selection by not using Control. Again, a really useful one for selecting multiple lines of text. Split the editor to our right. We'll clone the file that I've currently got open and put it on the right, and then use Control-1 to go back to the left-hand side. Control-2 will take me to the next editor across. Control / will then pop another one. Now I can do 1, 2, 3. Control-K and then Control / will then split the editor. Whoa! It's asking if I want to leave the meeting. No, WebEx, I don't want to leave the meeting. That would be a terrible idea. It'd be a very short one if I actually left the meeting. There we go. Control-K, Control / will then split horizontally rather than vertically. So if you've got like a 4K monitor, or maybe you're working on like a widescreen monitor or something like that, you can have multiple files kind of open side by side or vertically, whatever is going to be the right format for you. And let's just close off all of those ones there. Control-D will add the next match for the selection to the selection buffer. So I can use Control-D to select all of the controls that are along here, and then I can change them with CMD. So that can be useful if you're in a language that maybe doesn't support like variable renaming or anything like that, or like you're in a Markdown file and you want to select a bunch of stuff, or select a subset of it. So you can do a find and replace, but you don't want to replace every reference of that in the file. You just want to do a sub-selection of those. I tend to use Control-D much more than I use find and replace for doing the selections. And escape will take you back to where your cursor started from. If we come down, keep going through my notes. So Control-B will toggle the visibility of the sidebar. Okay, useful if you want to tie away some of the stuff that you're trying to focus on, just the thing that you're doing right now. I'm just focusing on the editor surface, so I don't want to have the rest of the stuff open. So I'm just going to close off the sidebar and things like that. Control K, Control R. This will actually give you the full keyboard shortcut reference for the operating system you're on. So this is loaded up the Windows reference because that's where I'm at. But if you're on a Mac, it will give you the Mac references. So if you are wanting to know, like, there's many more shortcuts that I'm not going to touch today, but if you want to get those, Control K, Control R will get you to the full reference. Another one from that, Control K, Control S will bring up the keyboard shortcuts that are defined within inside of your editor. And something that's interesting that I only learned about a couple of days ago in here is that if we have a look at the third column here, it's the heading of when, across there. This is when will those keyboard shortcuts actually be activated? You can conditionally enable a keyboard shortcut. And why would that be useful? Like I said, I've only just learned about this one, so I haven't quite worked out all the use cases for it. But something that it is used for, what VS Code actually ships with it being used for, is what F5 does. So F5 will start the debugger if there are debuggers available and you're not currently debugging. But if you are debugging, F5 will be remapped to doing a debug continue. So again, like I said, I'm not quite sure of all the use cases that I'd want for this because I've only just learned about it. But it's interesting to see that it's there, it's functionality that's available, and like maybe I've got keyboard shortcuts that are going to be relevant for a particular language that are not going to be useful in others. So I can conditionally enable them based off of the language of a file that I've got open. An interesting tip, and like I said, I haven't kind of worked out when to use it just yet. Alt up and down will move a line up or down in the direction of play, and then similarly Control will scroll the screen in the direction that you're doing it. So again, just like navigating around a file, it's like, oh, what's being hidden behind the pop-up thing that I've got having there from the screencast mode? Well, I can just scroll the editor without having to touch this mouse, and I've got a very simplistic mouse because I haven't upgraded to something fancy and ergonomic and Bluetooth. It's got a cable coming out of it, and that scares me. If you're in a language that supports go to reference, so let's jump over to a different file I've got here. F12 will go to that reference based off of the symbols that are inside of that, being detected within inside of that file, and Shift F12 will show usings of that symbol. So if you've come from Visual Studio, you're probably very familiar with that as an option there, and it actually looks and feels very similar to the Visual Studio form of it. And probably the last keyboard shortcut that I use a lot is Control K V, Control K V, not Control K, Control V, and that brings up a Markdown preview to the side. So again, useful if you're working on like a Markdown document. I do my blogging in Markdown files, so I can pop that up and I can just see what it looks like and what kind of a rough guide of what the rendered HTML is going to look like from that Markdown file. You're writing GitHub like README files or any sort of Markdown files. You can just pop that to the side and have it there. And we'll keep in sync as well, this file is not particularly big, so it's not causing the view on the preview view to scroll. But if I had one that would scroll, it will actually scroll in sync with the Markdown file as well that I've got. So that's keyboard shortcuts. I want to talk about now just some general like interesting productivity things. The command palette. The command palette is probably the first thing that you need to commit to muscle memory. Like, if you take nothing away as a new user of VS Code, if you take no keyboard shortcut away other than the command palette, I've done my job, because everything you can do in VS Code, you can do for the command palette. That's Control-Shift-P will bring it up. And we can see it here. This is everything that that I might want to do. So I can see things that are contributed by extensions. I've got Azure Functions installed. I can come down to, there's the debugger, so I can like enable breakpoints, like all that sort of stuff that you might use the mouse to go through and like navigate through menus to do. You can do it entirely from the command palette here. I can also, from the command palette, you notice that it starts with a greater than symbol. If I delete that, it drops into the file palette. So now I can navigate through all the files within inside of the folders that I've got open inside of this workspace in VS Code. If I do question mark, it will then tell me, well, here's all the other things that I could do from the palette. So I could do, say, hash to find all the symbols. Now, this is actually just a repo full of Markdown files. So all the symbols are just the headers within inside of Markdown files. So I can easily jump through to like the keyboard shortcuts, stuff like that. If I was in a language that is strongly typed, such as my F# application over here, I can go Control P to bring up the shorthand version of this. Hash will then find me all the symbols throughout the entire code base. Or if I start with mat, I can find symbols with their type. If I at colon, I can then group them by their type. So inside of this particular file, what are the symbols that are available? And of those symbols, what are their types? So I can find here are all the classes defined, here are all the fields, and there's a symbol module inside of that. So you can use that again to quickly navigate around a file and find things that you know that are there. Yeah, if you're coming from, if you're doing .NET development inside of VS Code, this is very similar to what you've experienced using Visual Studio. It has this same sort of functionality. Again, from the command palette, we can also access the terminal. So type term, and then it says, well, I don't actually have any terminal available yet, but I could create a new terminal. I could go back to the command palette, type term, and then create another terminal. And we go term, create a third one. And let's just do like an ls in term 3, and we go term 1.1, and I can jump back to the first one, so I can navigate through multiple terminal instances. If you've got multiple terminal instances open, maybe you're running like a full stack application, so you've got create React app or NG running in one terminal, and then you've got a backend that's in Node or in .NET or whatever. You might have them all running on different terminals, and so you can just swap between those quite easily. But let's kill off all of these terminals because we don't need them there. Exit. From here as well, from our palette, I can type view, and then this gives me access to all the stuff in the sidebar. I can go to the Explorer view, and that will pop that open for me. I can go to view debug, which is actually not going to do debug console. So if I wanted to jump through debug console at the bottom, from view, I could go to source control and see uncommitted changes. I could go view folders, and this will pop me into the folder explorer specifically and put my cursor context there. So now as I navigate up and down, I understand that the contrast might not be great for everyone's screen, but trust me when the keyboard key presses are actually changing the position of the selected file that I've got there. So I can jump around. Okay, so like the command palette is super powerful, and there's so many things we can do. I'm just going to hide the sidebar though. Another thing that it's all well and good to have all this information available to us in VS Code, but sometimes you just want to have, you just want something to be simplistic. And this is where Zen Mode. I use Zen Mode for writing, particularly writing Markdown files. Like in that case, I don't care about uncommitted files yet because I'm just working on a new blog post, or I don't need the status bar open and things like that. So Control-KZ will bring up Zen Mode, which will get rid of pretty much everything except for the text file that you're working on. Just like really focus where your vision is at. And then I can come into settings and say, well, actually, no, Zen Mode, I still want to see line numbers. So I can turn line numbers back on. The only problem with Zen Mode is you've got to toggle back and forth for setting changes to apply. And there we go. Now I've got line numbers because I still find that useful in Zen Mode. Regardless, I like to know where I'm at and know what line I'm on. We'll pop out of Zen Mode for now. Collapse all the terminal stuff that I've got here. Okay. It's something that I find useful from an accessibility standpoint is edit rules. So I'll come back in here and we'll go rules and rulers, sorry. And then we're going to edit this in settings.json. Sometimes you need to drop into the JSON file rather than working in the editor UI. Just some of the settings in VS Code are too complex for that. And let's just copy some stuff that I've got here in my notes. So what this has done is added a couple of guidelines into the editor surface. So at 20 columns, I've got a lovely fuchsia color, and then I have the color of coffee. Did you know coffee is a hex code? I have hex code coffee at column number 80. Now, where might this be useful? Well, let's say I'm working on a presentation where I know that I'm going to be zoomed in, and I want to know, well, I don't want to have to scroll sideways for everyone to be able to see code. I don't want to have like line runs where things kind of just break at weird positions. So I can have guidelines in there to let me know, well, this is how far I want to go, because that's where the optimal screen width will be for what I'm presenting out. With someone on your team that has accessibility requirements, like they maybe have some vision impairments, so they actually have a highly zoomed in editor or an exceptionally large font size, and you want to make sure that they're not constantly scrolling left and right to read all the code, because you're working on a 4K monitor at 12-point font, and they're unfortunately unable to read a line that is 300 columns wide without scrolling like endlessly across it. So it's a useful tip in there. It has a number of valid use cases, but it's not going to be right for every single scenario, unless you're someone that like is really adamant about everything has to be no more than 80 columns width, because that was the width of TTY on Unix systems back in the day. Something else that is interesting as well about the way settings are defined is that you can scope settings for a specific language. So I've got one here that I'm going to pop into my JavaScript settings. So I'll come up to the top, and I have JavaScript here. So we can do language-specific settings by putting the language inside of square brackets, and we'll denote to our the contributor, or to the editor, to only apply the settings when a language matches that thing. What I've added is a code action on save. So when I brought up the command palette here, some of these actions that can be done here are going to be able to impact the open text file. Now, maybe it's going to be reordering using statements or imports inside of the JavaScript file. Well, I can actually get it to automatically do those on save. I have a lint rule that says that I have to alphabetize all my my import statements in the JavaScript file. Well, I don't have to like just run ESLint fix every single time or manually do that. I can have it do that on file save. In fact, I've actually got an example of that here. So Path and FS are imported. They're backwards for from an alphabetized standpoint. Because I've now added that code editor, the on save action, if I hit Control S and save the file, it's just done that reorder for me. I think like little things that can be useful for you, just like quality of life improvements that that you can have in there. Line numbers. Line numbers are an interesting one. Let's come into settings. Actually, let's pop this over to the side, and we're going to go line numbers, pop that there, and then we'll have our README file here. So where did line numbers go? Line numbers. Okay, so I've got line numbers turned on because I like having line numbers turned on. You can turn them off if you prefer, although I don't understand how someone would work with line numbers off, but that's a personal opinion of mine. But we can also set relative line numbers. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, what's a relative line number? Well, it's relative to the cursor position. So you'll see in the line number column here on the side, I'm on line 85, and it's counting backwards 1 through 11 above that, or it's counting forwards 1 to 6, because then it hits the end of the file. And then as I move around, the relative numbers change. And this can be useful for like if you're doing like pair programming and being like, so you don't have to do the mental math of what's 6 lines above the current line. Well, no, it's 6 lines above. I can see it's literally 6 lines above. Or if you're working with something like Vim, I saw someone posted the VS Code Vim extension, and you're doing relative operations instead of VS Code, so you're using the Vim extensions. Lastly is interval line numbers. This will only show line numbers every 10 lines, as well as the current line. So 70, 80, 90, and 76. Okay, so that's a bunch of stuff that I use pretty much daily from the product, actually, except for line numbers. I'm still going to keep them to show on every single line because I like that. So I use a lot of that stuff almost daily when I'm working with VS Code. The next thing I want to talk about is tasks. Tasks, people tend to think of those as that's the thing that you run, like when I'm doing a build step, or I'm like doing a .NET clean or something like that. But tasks are essentially a way to run anything in a shell context with inside of VS Code. So I have a .VS Code folder here, and then a task.json file. And this is actually the repo for my website. So what I've got here is I actually have some tasks for creating a new post. I have the scripts that run on Windows or Linux, but it's just a task. It's just going to execute a shell file inside of a terminal context. So I can go Control P, task, and then this will bring up a list of all the tasks that are available. I could type new post. I've configured this one to prompt me for some information. So hello NDC Sydney, and then that's going to just execute a task that I've predefined by running a shell script, and then that's created me a new blog article. I wanted to kind of throw that in there because tasks themselves, I think people just they don't realize how you can use them other than trying to run a lot of the common things from a command line, like npm install, npm run, npm build, or .NET command, like the equivalent .NET commands or pip commands or whatever your language might be. Okay, we'll jump back to our slides, and I want to talk a bit about how you actually use a slide deck and navigate around a PowerPoint presentation. Now, I want to talk about snippets. Snippets are something that they're just useful for getting rid of repeatable things of code. Like if there's something that you constantly have to do, maybe you're working on a project where you have a structure to the way that you define a new React component. Well, you create a snippet that defines how that React component will be created in a new file. So you can just type in a prefix, which when time completed, it will then output all of that predefined code. Another thing that I've actually noticed, and if I jump down to this one here, is that, so this is the VS Code source code. And if we come into the VS Code folder, code snippets are in a .code snippets file. And they've actually got here a code snippet for adding the license header to every file. So you just type that in. So if you're doing an open source project, maybe you want to have license headers in all your files, you can do that using a code snippet. So you don't have to remember to copy and paste it everywhere or have like a build task that's going to do that for you. Just have a code snippet that you can type and quickly insert that. I also use it a lot when presenting and I'm doing like a live coding demo. I don't want to have to type out the code entirely from memory, so I just have the code written as a snippet that automatically injects that. Okay, so back to our slides and extensions. Now, everyone's going to have opinions on what extensions you need to do. Like you search Medium or Dev2 or pretty much everyone's personal website, they will have the top 10 extensions you need to install for VS Code. And everyone's going to have opinions on what is required and what's mandatory. And it's going to also vary depending on what language. Like if you're doing Python development, well, you probably don't care to install the C# extensions, do you? I want to focus on a couple of extensions that I find really useful that are general purpose. Whoops. They didn't pop in as fast as I was expecting, and we navigate to the wrong slide. So editor config, this is a really useful one for defining the way that you want files, file rules essentially. So what is the line names you want? What is the indent style you want? What is the indent depth and stuff like that? Editor config is a file that you put in the root of your workspace or nested. There's heuristic rules around that, and then this extension will just apply those rules to settings in VS Code to make sure that files adhere to what you do. I use this a lot in open source projects because that way I don't have to have like in the contributor document it's like, make sure you use spaces, not tabs or whatever it might be. Peacock is another really useful extension if you're working with a lot of VS Code instances. In fact, I've actually had that running the whole time, and it's done some subtle changes to the different VS Code instances I have running. If we all tab around, you'll see that like this one here has a little bit of a pinkish border. If I click on this one, it had sort of a teal green color to it. The F# one has sort of a mauvish aubergine color to it. And that's what Peacock does. It just adds some subtle changes to a single VS Code that's running and doesn't like replace your theme or anything like that, because that is then shared across all of the editors you've got open. And that's useful if you like maybe you've got a couple of editors open, as I said. One's got your back end, one's got the front end. You just want to make sure you as you're all tapping around, you land in the right location. If you're working with GitHub, I can't recommend the GitHub pull request and issues extension more. It basically allows you to do the common things you'll do with pull requests and issues in the web browser, but do it from within inside of VS Code itself. I like to combine this with a to-do highlight or a similar sort of extension where just annotate the code with to-dos and fix me's, etc. And then I can select that bit of code, use the pull request extension or the actions that it provides to the command palette to then create an issue from the selection. So I simplify that workflow of like select something, copy it, navigate to the browser, open the right GitHub repo and create an issue. You do that just entirely from VS Code. Code spell checker is probably fairly obvious in what it does, and as someone who speaks only English and Australian English, I get really frustrated by the number of Zs that it wants to do in there, and that it doesn't think that that color has a U in it. But it works for a lot of it, and because I do my blogging out of VS Code, Code Spell Checker is super useful for that. And just like generally speaking, it will help you not create incorrect variable names as well. I worked on a project where we had a database column that was named person name history because we spelt it incorrectly and we didn't realize, and it was just too much effort to go back and fix it. So it was forever person name histories. REST client. There's a lot of REST tools out there like Postman, etc. But I like using REST client in VS Code because then it forces me to like any APIs, like API commands that I want, and I think that everyone should be using. I'm actually very much forced to put them into source control because REST client just has a file that's inside of that same workspace, which will naturally then be committed along with the rest of your source control. No, sorry, source code to source control. I know you can do that with things like Postman, you can export collections and stuff like that, but by having them in the editor and having them like very clearly as part of that repository, it makes it easier to remember that they are part of the repository. We've talked a lot about how we can customize our environment and customize our VS Code, but what about if we want to do standardization and make it easier? Something that I learned when I was doing consulting, and I did consulting for nearly 10 years, was that you go to a new client or you start a new job and they go, okay, so here's your computer, here's the first page of the wiki, we'll see you at the end of the week, hopefully your machine's set up, and you've gone through everything and you've installed all the stuff that it said, and then nothing runs and doesn't compile because it turns out that, well, they said to install Node, but it didn't say install Node 8 because that's actually where it's pinned and you installed Node 14. And now you've got to go back and change the versions and you've installed wrong things and so on and so forth. Well, that can all, we can start addressing some of that with VS Code. And similarly from like an open source standpoint, you want to really reduce the friction of someone being able to get up and being productive with your code base. So things like, the line endings that you want to use, the indent styles, you want to make sure that not the first thing that you do on a pull request is go, sorry, rejected. Can you actually use spaces, not tabs? Because that's just frustrating and that's a barrier to entry for someone else to contribute. So with VS Code, we can create settings that live within inside of the actual workspace. And we can see that in action here if I jump over to the VS Code codebase. So they've got a settings.json file here. And the very first thing that they do is they say editor insert spaces false. So what that forces the editor to do is always insert tabs. Now, I didn't know that this was a tabs white space based code base, and I don't need to know that. I don't need to change my editor. They're enforcing that rule when I when I load things up. I don't have to think about that sort of stuff. And they've also got other things in here, like they're changing how NPM works. They're saying that NPM will actually use Yarn. So the package manager that the NPM extension is going to use is Yarn, not NPM. They're configuring how like Git works and stuff like that, which makes it really useful to ensure that, like me as like a drive-by contributor, and I just want to add something quickly to it. Well, I don't have to, have this cycle of, well, what should I have done, or like what was the mistake I made in it, and formatting things incorrectly. And the other thing that they do is they provide a bunch of recommended extensions. They use ESLint as their linting tool. So it says, well, we recommend that you would install ESLint. If I didn't have that installed, I would get a notification saying, hey, you should probably install this. Similar with editor config, it recommends that I should have that there. We actually see that here, and if I just hide myself, we see this little notification saying, well, there's recommended extensions you don't have installed. Would you like to install them? So now me, as someone who's coming through and attempting to contribute, I'm getting encouraged down the path of, this is how we want your machine set up so that you can be an effective contributor to our project. But that doesn't solve one of the problems I talked about. You've installed the wrong version of a particular dependency, or you've installed the wrong Node version or Python. You've installed Python 3, not 2.7, or whatever it might be. And this is where dev container starts to come in and really can open up a massive amount of power there. So dev containers allows you to create a Docker workspace in which you run your entire VS Code instance in. So because you control that Docker file that you're building and then the Docker image as a result of it, Well, you can just put in there. And again, the VS Code codebase actually does this. So I'll pop up our notifications down here. There's another notification that says, well, this contains a dev containers configuration file. Do you want to open this as a dev container? Now, I've already done that just to speed things up. We'll just have a quick look at what this dev containers folder has within it. So you create a folder called .dev containers in the root of your workspace, and we create a dev containers JSON file. And inside of this, we do things like, well, here's the image to use, or if you wanted to have the Docker file in here and it compiles the Docker file every time, you can have that. But this is just pulling an image from the registry. It configures how to mount the workspace. So this is what what it's mounting. Where is it going to mount it to? Oops, if we scroll across, and what kind of mount attributes to put into Docker. Other things like default settings. Well, the default terminal is going to be bin bash because that's the one that obviously they've configured inside of this image. What ports to forward out. So if I've got like a web server in there, we make sure that these ports are exposed from Docker so that I can actually connect to the web server. What extensions do I need? Well, here's the extensions that are going to be pre-installed into that VS Code instance when I start up the dev container. I don't even have to think about it. I don't get notifications. It will just start up for me. And we can see that here is the dev container version running. If I popped out to the side, we'll notice that I actually have a few less extensions inside of my dev container. I don't have Azure or Liveshare or the GitHub one. Oh no, I don't have the GitHub one, sorry. But that's because, well, the dev container didn't need them, so it didn't include them anyway. And now if I was to do node version, so it's running node 12, whereas the one that I have just on my machine, node version, is node 14. So already I was potentially out of sync with where they wanted the contributor to be on dependencies. They've predefined all of that for me. So this is something like, if it's an open source project, you can really lower the barrier to entry. If you're working in a place where you're doing education of students, you can give them a dev container and they don't have to install stuff on their machine. If you're working in a team environment on internal projects, you can have dev containers that just means that you don't have to worry about installing everything for someone. And as you roll forward on dependencies, you just roll a new container out for people to use. So dev containers is actually part of the remote extensions in VS Code. Now, VS Code, and while I don't want to harp too much about extensions, I actually don't see remote extensions as really extensions of VS Code. I think they're just, it's a part of VS Code that I don't think I could live without, because I actually do most of my work in WSL. So what that means is that I use the remote extensions to connect to that WSL environment, and I do all of my work there. So VS Code is actually written to be a client-server application. So we have a client application that runs on Windows or Mac or Linux or whatever your host OS is, and that's where UI components will run, like things like your themes, icon packs, kind of UI level extensions that work with the VS Code shell, the Electron application. They run on your primary OS. But let's say that, yeah, I have WSL or I have a remote container, like a dev container like that, or maybe I want to have an SSH into a Raspberry Pi and I want to dev on that. Well, it actually installs a server there, which is where the extensions that need to work with the host machine, things like, does it need to talk to Node? Does it need to talk to .NET? Does it need to run a debugger? Does it need to expose ports? And they're done on this remote host. And VS Code's client UI will then talk to its host server and do all the translations back and forth so that you can access things like your source control, the terminal, because those are all on this remote file system. But as far as the editor is aware, it's just a file system that you've got access to. It doesn't know that you're connected to a Raspberry Pi that's really underpowered compared to your desktop or your laptop, or it doesn't know that you're running in a stripped down Docker container on Windows, through Windows when you're just connected to it. It just sees it as its primary, as its way of communicating. That is taken a step further with code spaces. Code spaces is something that is in preview through GitHub. So I think it's github.com/features/codespaces. I'm pretty sure that my bot is running and it has auto-posted some links to the chat with some of this in Slack. If not, I will make sure that all the links go across there after this session. But in code spaces, I just realized that you haven't been able to see me. Well, I mean, I'm sure that not many people are upset over that. They have my pretty face back. The code spaces, I actually, I started this up early, but it timed out because the code space will shut down after 30 minutes of idle activity. But this is running in the browser. So the way we get to a code space, assuming that you've signed up for the beta, is that you come to a GitHub repo, and where you would go, copy using the GitHub command line or the HTTPS or SSH, I can do open with code space. And I've already got a code space open. I just wanted to speed up the process a little bit, but that will go ahead and start up in the browser. Like this is VS Code running in the browser. Remember, I said at the start is written in web tech, HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. Well, instead of compiling it to Electron, well, why not just compile it to run in the browser? Fun fact: you can actually install this as a progressive web app. You can install this onto your machine, so you can install code spaces so you can install the browser version of VS Code on a machine, so you don't have to run it in the browser. It blows my mind. It's like installing from an MSI or like a DVD or something like that. You can install it by clicking a link in the browser. But now I have full access to everything, like the terminal. I can do like an npm start here. I could go turn and then create another terminal, and then I can do npm start in a different. Oh, actually no, not in there. I'm going to go to API, and then I can do npm start. So I can run some Node web servers inside of a terminal, inside of a like in a browser. Like I'm in a browser working with Batch. It's crazy. Most of the shortcut keys are the same as if you're using the desktop one. Some of them aren't identical, like because the browser takes precedence. So something like F12 is Control F12 in the in-browser code spaces, because F12 will start the dev tools instead of open up the dev tools in the browser instead of navigating the symbol. But yeah, so this is all up and running. And if we go back to terminal 1, we'll say, okay, we've started our web server. It's at localhost 3000. Where the heck is localhost going to be? Well, with code spaces, it actually sets up some forwarded ports. So I can click this open in browser, and now I can access the code space hosted the localhost via a reverse proxy, so that I can run my web application, and it all kind of works. And this is all running from the browser on the cloud, which is somewhere. I don't know. It's quite cloudy here in Sydney, which means that there's probably a lot more cloud available. But this is my running application. If I pop the dev tools, it's going to be doing some network requests in a moment. So I can, this is just a little trivia game that I wrote. It's using GraphQL. And then what does RIP stand for? Cool. We'll do some random one. And I got it wrong, unfortunately. But this is doing network requests to like a GraphQL endpoint, which is running inside of Azure Functions, which is running in a remote container on a code space somewhere. Mind-blowing, at least for me. This is the COVID portion of the talk. We've got to have one. Working collaboratively, I don't think anyone would deny the value of collaborative working with inside of a development team. And the fact that we're now all remote working, it makes that a whole lot harder. I'm sure that a lot of people have had the experience of being on like a screen shared call in insert choice of web calling technology here, where someone is you're trying to help someone debug a problem, and you're just like, can you click that file? No, sorry, that and you just wanted to reach through the screen and grab the mouse and navigate around, and it can be really frustrating because you want to sit with someone and be able to prepare program with them or help them debug a problem, but it's so much harder when you can't physically sit with someone. And that's where something like Liveshare comes into play. So Liveshare is a way to share your editor over the internet so that anyone that's got access to the URL can be in a collaborative editor experience. Now, like slides don't do it justice on how this works. So we're going to come back over here and we're going to share this using the code space. Oops, not the pull request. So I have obviously my code space running, and I can start a collaboration session. And what this is going to do is from the code space running in a browser on a container somewhere. It's going to then create a link that I can have popped in behind me, where I will be able to, let's just copy that. And then we're going to open up a new window, paste it in, and if anyone is quick enough at typing what that is into their browser, you'll be able to join my running Liveshare experience. Now, I didn't connect to Liveshare in the browser. I connect with Visual Studio or VS Code. Because I actually have VS Code Insiders, it won't prompt me to jump into VS Code Insiders. So I can say, come into that as well. Actually, let's just pop a new instance of VS Code. Pop a new instance of it here. Obviously, Peacock is not running on this one because I haven't set a Peacock on it. Come back to Liveshare, and then I'm going to join a collaboration section. Once all the extensions loaded, there we go. Paste that in, enter, and let's just pop that to the side. Where is my code space? It is here. I'm going to zoom these back out to default zoom. Oops, reset zoom, just because it's kind of tricky. There's some stuff sort of going on. But now my local one, so on the right-hand side is VS Code running on my desktop, and on the left-hand side is VS Code running in the browser through a code space. Down the bottom here, it's gone, oh, hey, the host is sharing a web server on localhost 3000. Would you like to connect to that? Sure, I'd like to connect to that. So that's going to pop into localhost 3000. That's right, localhost 3000, which is the local host of the container running behind the code space. So I'm now connected to the same web endpoint. And in my right-hand side here, so this is the remote connected person, I can be like, okay, well, I want to have a look around the files here. Let's have a look into this file. And then I can just start poking around what's here. And this is in my configured version of the editor. I can change my theme, Control-K-T, I think it is. No. Let's just go theme. I can go, well, actually, on my theme, let's go 1984, bit of like synth pop style sort of color scheme, but that's like, this is how I want to work. And now I've got all the files I can navigate around. As the host, I can say, well, I want to follow the participant that's in there. Oh, that's where they're at. They're navigating around, and you can see this little green bubble that's popping up in the left-hand side. That's as I'm clicking the cursor around. And let's say, well, no, I want to go to a different file, open that here, and then the host is now following me around. So this makes it so much easier to do collaboration and kind of navigating around. And like that to me, like the fact that we can do that, and this is running in a browser and in a desktop application, and they're talking to each other. It's read write, so I can do like hello NDC. So I can actually help them by like executing code. The terminal at the bottom is shared, so that change forced a reload on the terminal. I could say, well, I want a new terminal. Oh, sorry, no, I don't want a new terminal. I want to use one of these terminals and go, I'm going to kill your web server on you. And then I have to then get access to the terminal. But now, as the remote participant, I can help them with their from their terminal as well. I can install dependencies for them and so on and so forth. If I make that read write for everyone. Another fun fact that I learned while doing a live share with a friend is that you can write to their clipboard on Windows from a live share. So that's fun. And yeah, you can ask Amy during her session. I think that's up next. I forget which about is it useful to have someone remotely connected and writing to your terminal? But we're nearly out of time, and I basically haven't scratched the surface on what you can do with VS Code. There is so many things that I use it for. I use it for writing blog posts. I use it for writing code because, well, it's a text editor. You can use it as the primary diff tool for Git. You might be using something like Kraken or Git extensions or something like not command line to work with Git. But you can use VS Code as the diff and merge tool because, well, maybe you prefer that as an experience. You can have it so that from the command line, when you launch VS Code, you can provide with command line flags to do things like open a particular file. you can even open a particular file at a particular line number. You can have it start with extensions if you feel you've got some instability issues. You can launch it without extensions enabled and all that sort of stuff. Now, I didn't even talk about actually using debugging portions of VS Code. Like there is a debugger in VS Code, and you can use that. But I didn't even touch on that today. But I said, I think we're nearly out of time. My clock is reading about 4 minutes until we're wrapping up. So I might have time for one or two questions on the call, like the session now. But I will be hanging out in the Slack channel for the rest of the day. If you've got any questions, feel free to ping me there. I hope that you've taken away a couple of tips for doing more for optimizing the way that you work with VS Code. Again, my name is Aaron Powell. This is where you can find me on the internet. Thank you for hanging out on the session today. If you're watching this on YouTube, sorry, you're not going to be able to talk to me on Slack, but you can ping me on the variety of social media endpoints that I have here. But again, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Virtual NDC Sydney.
That was excellent, Aaron. Thank you very much. And very, very slick presentation as well. I love the way you're doing all the OBS transitions, and I just noticed you have a bot that has been sharing links in the Slack workspace the whole time you've been talking to us.
Yes, I was hoping it was working. Yes, I do have a Slack bot that has been sharing. So Bot Aaron is in Slack at the moment and has shared a whole heap of useful links throughout today.
That is phenomenal. Really, really amazing work, man. Thank you. So, any questions from any of our participants and attendees?
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the questions directly. I actually can't read the chat at the moment because it is that way. That way, I've got to lean to read it because it's on a vertical monitor. So yes, please just unmute yourself. It's a lot more fun as well, and then you can be forever immortalized in a YouTube video.
Oh, we're on YouTube now as well.
No, but I'm assuming the videos are going up on YouTube at some point.
Oh, yeah. No, they will be. So, no, I just wondered, I figured years ago, but yes, didn't know if you were doing a stream as well, so...
No, I chose not to stream this straight to YouTube. I thought we'll do some editing afterwards.
Cool. No, there do not appear to be any questions, so... I guess
awesome.
we can wrap that one up. Thank you very much for speaking. Thank you, everyone, for